Hello, and thank you for all attending today's presentation on the new Solo Server activation features. My name is Mike Wozniak, the CTO and founder of Concept Software. Also helping me today with the presentation is Abram Prusada from the software development team. This is the first event in a series of technical deep dives of the various aspects of the software key system. As you all know, the software product activation is one of the core features of Solo Server. Last year, in 2009, several new features in the area of product activation were added into Solo Server. Today I'm going to talk about four main topics. First, we're going to talk about some of the new features that are available to you without any source code changes. You can start using them immediately without having to redeploy any new application or update any of your customers. We'll talk about some challenges faced by the initial Solo activation paradigm before these new features were added. We'll then talk about the three new activation web services themselves. We'll also take a quick step back and discuss our web service infrastructure and talk about web services in general for those of you who might be unfamiliar with this concept. I will then, after these topics, will give a couple quick demos to hopefully solidify your understanding. Please note that all of your microphones are muted during this presentation. In the GoToWebinar control panel applet, you should see a question section. You can type your question there and choose to send. Abram will be monitoring questions along the way, responding to some of them directly, and saving some of them for discussion at the end. Please note that this presentation is to complement a PDF that is currently available on our support portal download. So to start, I'm going to do two quick polls. The first poll is to see currently what interfaces you are currently using with Protection Plus. So if you just take a moment to respond to whether you're using Instant Plus, whether you're using our .NET component, SKCLNet, our ActiveX component, our DLL interface, or our static library. Okay, great. So we have, let's see, basically most people are using the .NET component, just under half. We've got about, the next most popular is Instant Plus, and then a few people are using the DLL interface and the static library. And then one other poll we'll ask real quick, which is whether or not you are currently using Solo Server. So you can choose whether you are not currently using it, whether you're using the automation client library, the SK underscore functions, the client services library, which call our web services, whether you're calling the web services directly from your application, or maybe you just don't know. Okay, great. So it looks like a few of you are new to or have not used Solo Server, and then pretty much a balance of the rest are distributed amongst the rest of the options, the automation client, the client services library, and the direct web service calls. Okay, so When a license has, for those of you that are using Solo Server, and I guess I should preface by saying that the main focus of this presentation is for those of you that are already familiar with Solo Server. So there may be some topics here that those of you that have never used Solo may not understand, but hopefully you'll still get a good idea of some of the new features that we've added into Solo, and you'll want to start using it. So when an existing license has 0 activations left, the customer must contact you in order to receive permission to reactivate that license. Of course, we know that computer crashes, computer hardware component upgrades, or even computer complete replacements happen all the time for some customers. So one of the new features that we have is called the product option setting called allow additional activation days. And this will help cut down on customer contact when they have not activated for a set amount of time. So let's say you set this parameter to 180 and a customer uses their last activation on January 1st. They will be able to activate on July 1st without contacting you. This could save on customer frustration and, of course, save you time by basically telling the server that it's okay to grant another activation even though they were previously out of activations, as long as a certain number of days have elapsed. Setting this parameter to 365 will allow the user to change their hardware once yearly and still reactivate without needing to contact support for an additional activation. Now keep in mind that this still is going to prevent widespread reuse of the same license ID, because if they use that license to activate another time, the activation count will stay at 0 and they will need to wait another additional activation days, number of days, before they can activate again without contacting you. Of course, you can always override this more often if necessary. Another new feature that's available is that prior to processing activation requests, the system now performs a velocity check against the activation rejection log, both by the license ID and IP address. This will prevent brute force attempts at generating activation codes by locking out a specific license or IP address after multiple failed activation attempts within a short period of time. Those of you who are hosting your own Solo server can control these velocity checking parameters through the web.config file. Those of you that are using Instance Solo, our hosted service, can read about the velocity parameters that we have configured on this Solo instance in the downloadable PDF that was referenced earlier. Now keep in mind that the administration interface does allow resetting a license that has been locked out. So if for some reason the customer can't wait for that interval, which I think our server is set to 30 minutes, you can reset them right away. Another new feature is that when you deploy your application to a corporate or enterprise environment, you can now limit the physical sites that are allowed to activate licenses for your application. You can either predefine the allowed IP address, addresses, or IP network before you or when you enter the license into the system, so that only activations from that network are allowed, or you can tell the server that the first activation is the one that should set the rule for all future activations. That way, if a customer is in on a network in Orlando, where we're based, and they activate on a specific IP address, and they have another office in New York, then they would not be able to share that license ID with another site that's connected to the internet from a different IP address, because the very first activation request will be the one that sets the rule for all future. Now, there are many limitations in the way the first Solo activation scripts were designed. Many authors or software publishers do allow activation on multiple PCs. And while you can allow multiple instances of a license to be granted, you can't easily identify how often each license is checking in with Solo Server to verify the status. Let's face it, it would be nice to have a way to back up what the customer is saying when they call you for assistance with license concerns. Another challenge is that the license status that is available on the license details page affects all instances of the application running on customer computers. You can't revoke one specific license. Also, the existing online license transfer mechanism using Solo, which is the license_return.asp script that some of you have chosen to implement, and the threshold activation, which allows you to, allow customers to reactivate the same license on the same PC, perhaps after formatting or reinstalling, uses the 32-bit computer ID number to match the license instances, which is not always reliable or secure. So let's take a look at the current license details page. As I mentioned before, the license has a single status up there at the top marked A. We have a single timestamp for when any computer has communicated with Solo, marked B, last license check time. And we have a very basic activation log, marked C. So that's what's available or what has been available historically. And we'll show you the new stuff in a moment. But before that, let's talk about the 3 new activation web services. These will solve the above mentioned problems and also add significant new functionality for your application. The first is the Activate installation. It's called during the initial activation request. This replaces the previous call to the sk get tc data, which goes to getcode.asp, for those of you using the automation client. When the product option is configured to do so, a unique identifier called an installation ID is assigned and returned back to the application. This installation ID is what helps you identify each instance or copy of a license. Let's say, for example, you allow a customer to activate twice, once on their home computer and once on their work computer. In both cases, a unique installation ID will be assigned for each of those computers' licenses. Keep in mind that an installation ID is only generated when you allow online and file-based activations. Telephone-based activations does not generate an installation ID, and the customer never sees the installation ID. It's something that's passed back and forth between the application and the server during activation. Other thing to note about the Activate installation is that it is possible to pass up XML computer ID data instead of just the 32-bit representation that was previously available through Getcode. This means we have better computer matching for reactivations on the same PC. The next web method in our web service is called Check Installation Status. It is used to optionally poll the license status. Very similar to sk get license status, which returns information about the license. This uses the previously assigned installation ID to identify a specific PC's license. So again, if you allow, in the example I used before of allowing a work PC and a home PC, Each one would phone home to Solo with their unique identifier, and we would know the status of that specific license instead of just the status of the overall license. This web method will return the status information on that given installation. It does allow additional optional parameters to be passed up during this request, such as the product version, and you'll see an example of that in a little bit. And there are several parameters that are returned that used to require separate calls to separate scripts, such as the download expiration date, product option ID, etc. Other thing to keep in mind is that changing the license status, that one that was marked A on the previous picture, will revoke all installations. That is still the master status that will control all of the installations on that license. The last web method, called deactivate installation, is also optional. It's used to voluntarily give up a license from a specific PC. What it does is it marks the installation as deactivated. It increments the activation's left parameter so that that license can be activated on another machine. And it decrements a new parameter called deactivation's left. This is the equivalent and replacement of the license_return.asp script. Now, as I mentioned, the check installation status and the deactivate installation are both optional, but they are required if you want to have the most flexibility and control over your customer licenses. And just like controlling the number of activations through the activation's left parameter, you can optionally control the number of allowed deactivations before they must contact you for further approval. Now, you can specify unlimited deactivations, meaning the customer can move the license from machine to machine as many times as they want, but we did add that parameter such that you can control how many times they're allowed to do this voluntary deactivation process before they must contact you. So since some of you are using the automation client, you may not understand the term web service and web method. So let's just take a quick step back. A web service is an open standard for remote procedure calls. There are built-in mechanisms in .NET programming languages for referencing and calling web services. So I always call these 3 web services, but to be technically correct, it is one web service. That's the endpoint. The XML activation server is the endpoint, which you can consider to be like a remote library. And then each of the 3 calls, activate installation, check installation status, and deactivate installation, are called web methods. They're basically functions in that remote library. There's also, I added this point in this morning and probably put it in the wrong order, so I'll come back to it. So there is a new Protection Plus automation client library that has native functions for calling the new web services. So we did expose new functions there for calling web services in general. We did choose to implement these web services or web methods to use XML documents as both the input and output parameters. We did this to easily add new functionality without having to write a new web service. So instead of having a web method that has a fixed set of input parameters, it basically takes an XML document with all of the input parameters and the output parameters our output responses also come back as an XML document so that we can change the structure of that document over time without breaking any applications which are remotely calling these web methods. Now, going back to the client services DLL, we designed this DLL for those of you who are maybe not comfortable with XML. So it basically abstracts the, or it does the work of creating the XML document for you so that you can call a function with a specific set of input parameters. It will create the XML document, make the request to our server, process the XML response, and return back the responses in discrete parameters. So if and when we add new functionality to the web methods, there would be new functions created in client services or a new version of that DLL that would match or have the new input and output parameters. If you're comfortable with calling with manipulating XML in .NET, because there are quite a few functions in the .NET framework for manipulating XML, you do not need client services. Another new feature is that we use digital signatures on these XML documents along with public key cryptography for all of the requests and responses to help prevent tampering and hijacking of the requests and responses going back and forth to the server. So we'll give a quick demo here of the activation log. So previously, the very basic activation log used to show up down here under the activation log tab. However, there is a new view activation history link here at the top. And this gives us a wealth of information that has not been available before. So the type column, that identifies whether or how this activation was generated. This icon means it was a manual activation or a telephone activation. This icon means it was an online activation. So there are different icons so you know exactly how this activation was created. There's a status column which shows whether or not an activation request was granted or whether it was declined. So you can see everything that is happening in a logged basis for these different requests. You also see the installation ID column. And some of the entries here do not have installation IDs. So this is for a license that used some of the legacy activation scripts. Will not have an installation ID, so there are several here you can see. Any of the activations which were done online with these new web methods will have an installation ID. And of course, if this was a new license that only used installation IDs, only the online activations are going to be the ones, or the file-based activations, where an installation ID will be present. So even though you release a new version of your application using the new features, if you still allow telephone or manual-based activations, they will show up with this icon and not have an installation ID. Some other information that's available here. So instead of the single timestamp, the item that was marked B on the previous screenshot that I showed you, we now have a timestamp for each installation or instance of the license. We can see the last time it communicated with the server. We can also see if it has communicated with the server. So in this case, we have several licenses or several installations that have communicated, that have activated and phoned home with the server, and we have this one here which has activated but never communicated with the server. Now that could be because either the user is no longer using that license, or it could mean that they installed a firewall or something to block communication from the client to the server. When we click on the Show More, we can see more information about that installation. And here's some interesting information. I mentioned before that the product version can be passed up during activation and also during the check installation status routine. So we can see here that version 3.1.0.1 was the version that was installed on this customer's computer, but the last time it phoned home, they had upgraded it to 3.1.0.4. So this information can be very valuable to support personnel when the customer calls in for service. We can also see in this status column that it also has an X. This X saying that this installation has been deactivated. And in the additional information, we can see when it was deactivated and who deactivated it by, or who deactivated it. When the user voluntarily gives up their license through the deactivate installation web method, it will have the name web server versus I can, as an administrator, click on one of these action columns and deactivate a specific installation, and then it would have my username here in this field. And I'll give a demo of a deactivation in a little bit. Just make sure in my notes I got everything. Okay, so now let's do we have many people that are using Instant Plus, and Instant Plus is our wrapping interface, and there's also a DLL interface that has the most common forms of licensing business logic ready to go with little or no source code required, source code changes required. So I'm going to run the application, and I see my activation dialog. I'm going to come here. I have a test license for this little, I wrapped basically calculator, and I'm going to activate online with the license ID and password that's assigned by the server. Okay, my activation was successful, and when I click continue, the calculator application runs. If I come here to look at my activation log, I can see what version was activated. This was a successful activation, and here's the installation ID that was generated. I will go ahead and close the activation, or close the calculator program. Now, the way we allowed the deactivate installation to be easily implemented inside of Instant Plus is through a simple command line parameter. What you can do when you're installing your application on the customer's computer, you can create a separate shortcut that's called Deactivate Workstation, or whatever you want to call it. So you would have one icon which would launch the application, Calc, or we could have one start menu item that has Deactivate Workstation, which we'll call Calc with the Deactivate switch. So when I call that switch, or use that switch, I get prompted to the user gets prompted, do I really wish to deactivate this installation ID? If I say yes, It communicates with the server, and I get a message saying that my deactivation was successful. If I come back, of course, when I click OK, the activation dialog basically shows that now I'm not going to be able to run the calculator program anymore without activating it again on this PC. If I come back to my activation log and refresh, we can now see that it has been deactivated. We can see when it was deactivated and that it was deactivated by the user. Now what I'm going to do is go through that process one more time. I'm going to run the application. I'm going to go ahead and activate with the same license ID and password. I'm going to activate online. Oh, it already has the ID and password there. Okay, so the activation was successful. And then, of course, the calculator program does run. If I come back to my activation log, I will see that this was the original installation that was deactivated, and I can see the new activation request. I can see that it came from it was basically a reactivated computer. So I activated a computer that had already been activated with a specific installation. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to revoke. As an administrator, I'm going to revoke this license. Now when would I do that? And before I do that, I'm going to take a look at the View License Details page. So the activations left is 0. When I originally added this license, the activations left parameter was set to 1. When I performed the first activation, that number went down to 0. If another computer would attempt to activate the application, it would be rejected. When I chose to run the command line /deactivate switch and said, yes, I want to deactivate this workstation, the activations left parameter would increment back to 1. And then, of course, when I reactivated it yet again, it went back down to 0. So if I come back to the history, and let's say the customer calls and claims that they lost their computer a week ago, and they just now have a new one. You could come to the log for the license, and you can see, as long as the application is configured to communicate with the server, you can see the last time it communicated. Now, Instant Plus does have several parameters to configure how often it communicates with the server, and you can configure it whether communication with the server is required or optional. Those are all parameters you can specify. I happen to have this test calculator wrap configured to communicate with the server every time. That way, it makes this demo go a lot easier. So let's say, for example, the customer calls and says that a week or two ago they lost a computer and they need to reactivate. If you pull up this log and you see that the last time the software communicated was a week or two ago, you can somewhat validate that what they're saying is true. If it was today or less than 2 weeks ago, you can perhaps question whether or not they're being honest with you. You have a couple options. You could just grant them another activation, trust that they're telling you the truth, or you could find a way of pleasantly asking them, are you sure that you're not using this on another machine, because I'm going to revoke the license. If that machine actually did die, then the user will not have the luxury of being able to run the deactivate command and voluntarily give up the license, but I, as an administrator, can come and revoke the specific license or the specific installation. So I'll go ahead and revoke it. So now it does show deactivated. It does show my user ID that it was deactivated and when I deactivated it. So when I run the application again, I will automatically be presented with the activation screen, so that any other copies of the license will stop working whenever they are configured to communicate with the server. Now, if I come back to the activation log and refresh, and I look at the show more, I can see that this machine did attempt to communicate with us right now, and it returned back 5016, which basically means this installation has been deactivated. So when that customer, who may not have been telling the truth, communicates or attempts to run the application on the PC that they claimed was no longer available, and it stops working, and they call you for support, you can actually see everything that happened. Now, the other thing to note is that when a user uses the deactivate switch to voluntarily give up a license, they are able to activate it again on that PC. However, when you revoke a license from the administration interface, and as long as you are passing up the XML computer ID data instead of the long integer or the 32-bit computer ID data, it will find an exact match. It will see that that license has been revoked, and it will return an error code 5016 telling you that this machine has been revoked by an administrator and is not allowed to run. Why would we do that? Well, let's say an employee takes the software home and activates it there, and they are no longer with the company. If we have the activations left greater than 1, and they have a copy of the license ID and password, they will be able to activate that machine at any time or reactivate. So we do it such that when an administrator uses the revoke button, that machine is really revoked and cannot be reinstated by the user. So it prevents them from tampering. However, if you need to override that, you can come back. You would see here this was the request that was denied. You see why it was denied, because this was a revoked computer, and all you have to do is reinstate the installation that was revoked, and then you will be able to activate again. Okay, so just to reiterate basically what we talked about today, the new Solo Server activation features allow you better flexibility with licensing, as well as visibility on how customers are actively using your application, more control over your customer licenses, and more secure license transfer capabilities. If you go to our website and go to the support portal, the downloads area of our support portal has a PDF of documentation that goes over basically what is described here in more detail. It has the links to online samples that you can play with. Also, the links to if you want to get started with Instant Plus using this new functionality, how to go about using the command line switch and other important information for migrating your Instant Plus project to support the new installation ID functionality. So I will check in with Abram and see if there are any questions that would be appropriate to discuss here, and depending upon that, I do have some questions that I think might be good relevant. Okay, so one of the questions I have is where can I store, or I assume I need to store this installation ID when it comes back from the server. Yes, obviously when you call the activate installation request and you get an installation ID back from the server, that does need to be stored somewhere so that when you make subsequent calls to check installation status or deactivate installation, you can pass up that computer's installation ID. Now, in the latest versions of Protection Plus that were released in January, we did add a field into the license file, a string field, that you can access with the get varchar and set varchar functions to write that installation ID, which is just an alphanumeric string, into the file and then read it later. Another question, can I do a direct transfer, license transfer, from machine to machine without Solo Server? Although there is an unsupervised license transfer mechanism that is inherent to Protection Plus, this license transfer that we described here does require Solo. That is the most secure way, is when you have a central administration, central place or repository to track all of the activations and deactivations and license validations, is when you have a third party or a central service that's tracking all of that. Another good question, can I use this system to count the number of concurrent users of my application? Very good question. It's not recommended. Not recommended for several reasons. One, the activation log could grow ridiculously fast and be difficult to find meaningful information if a customer is calling for support. Basically, what would happen, or at least what I think the customer is asking, is can I call activate installation at the startup of my application, and then call deactivate installation when I exit, and then therefore count the number of concurrent users. So the activation log would grow for every one of those activation requests, and if you have a large number of users attached to a license, that log could be unmanageable. Also, there's no way to recover allocated licenses when the application terminates abnormally or disconnects from the network before it can deactivate its license. In that case, if you call activate installation and then lose your internet connectivity, or the application just has a crash and doesn't call deactivate installation, then that license is going to be consumed forever, and a administrator at your company will have to override and release that license. We are working on using Solo Server as a concurrency server. This will be a topic for a future webinar as this technology evolves. those of you that are interested in doing concurrent user limitation with Solo, we did publish a newsletter that's on the homepage of softwarekey.com in the lower right-hand corner under News. The March 2009 newsletter does have a link to a survey on the concepts of concurrency and licensing models, and would love to have your feedback through that survey. It'll be, I think, open until the end of April 2009.
We have a good question from Carol here, asking, are the digital signing and encryption mandatory?
Very good question. So it's not required. We can keep everything unencrypted. We do recommend to use digital signatures, however, for at least keeping the data secure. The content that is passed back and forth during the activation request is not doesn't require encryption. In fact, some of our customers have end users who work for the Department of Defense or other government agencies where they don't want encrypted information being passed from their computers over to an activation server. So they want to have everything in plain text so they can make sure that any sensitive information is not being passed. So the server can be configured to require encryption. It can be set to require digital signatures, or it can be set to allow basically plain text posts. That is a server setting that we must configure on your account. By default, we do have both the digital signature and encryption settings enabled for all accounts, but it's very easy to disable one or both of those features on an account-by-account basis. One thing to keep in mind is if you have a subset of customers where you don't want to use encryption but the rest you do, we can turn off the requirement for encryption, leave the requirement in place for the digital signatures, and as long as the request comes in encrypted, the response will come back encrypted. If the request comes up signed but not encrypted, the response will come back signed but not encrypted.
The next question I have here is, how can a license be revoked if the machine has no internet access and was originally licensed manually?
Well, first off, if the license is issued manually, and by manually a telephone or email activation, no installation is going to be generated on the server. In the log, it'll basically have a blank field for that column. And although you could, we have had some customers which have performed a manual activation but still attempt to do a license validation. You can do periodic license validations using the legacy scripts such as get license status to see whether or not the overall license is still valid. You will not be able to see if a specific instance or an installation of a license is still valid. But if the software doesn't ever communicate with the server, there's really no secure way of knowing that it has been deactivated. I do know that you can do a manual deactivation process using the same type of trigger code, protection plus trigger codes that you use to activate manually. You can deactivate, but the user could use imaging software or something to back up that license status before deactivation and restore it after deactivation so that it does revert back to an activated state. So if you do not have at least periodic optional communication with the server, or maybe you have periodic communication with the server that's optional, and but require communication with the server on an extended period of time, then you could do a successful revoke, meaning, and these are parameters that are available in Instant Plus. You can specify, I want the software to attempt to communicate with the server once a week, but I want to require communication with the server once a quarter. That way, at most, the user will be able to continue to use the software for that once a quarter, for that period of a quarter.
Okay, another question I have here is, how would you handle the following scenario? A customer has 2 branch offices, each with 5 PCs. They buy the software for one branch and activate 3 computers in that branch. How do we avoid then using the activations in another branch office?
Well, if each branch office is connected to the internet separately, you could use the IP address functionality to limit the activations to a specific IP address or IP network. If the 2 branch offices have a private or a leased line connection and they share an internet connection out, which probably unlikely in today's age, but could be possible, then each branch office will appear to be the same, coming from the same network. You would not be able to use the IP address limitations during activation.
Okay, the next question I have here is, if we move to the new methods, I guess we need to retain the old deactivation method for licenses which were previously activated using the older method.
Well, there's nothing that's stopping the license return script from working. So you can continue to mix and match old and new. In fact, the log that I showed you with the page of history was actually a log that had a couple years worth of data for that particular test license, and it did have all of the old license data down near the bottom, which did not have installations. You would be able to continue to use the license return feature there. There's a question here, where can I get documentation on the new web services? As mentioned here, the link that's on the PowerPoint, if you go to our website and go to the support portal, there is in the downloads area the PDF on new Solo Server activation web services. And also, when you log into your Solo account, in the top right-hand corner is the Solo manual. And when you open that up, there's a chapter on the left side for web services, and you will see the XML activation service. Well, great. We're just perfect timing here. We'd like to thank you for coming and participating and asking questions. We will be posting a recorded version of this presentation on our website in the future, and we will and look forward. You should look for our newsletter in April to announce the next deep dive seminar on which will be around this time next month. Thanks, and have a great day.